Hello, thank you for tuning in to listening to my literature review presentation. I hope you find it very informational as much as I did. So the article I chose is called LGBTQ plus self-acceptance and its relationship with minority stressors and mental health, a systematic literature review. So I am not quite sure why this article excludes the T in what is supposed to be LGBTQ+. So throughout the presentation, I will probably say the correct term, but I only said LGBTQ+, as what the authors included in the article. So that's just a little side note. I did look into the article and there's no reason why the T was excluded, so I am not quite sure about that. But moving forward, this article includes the investigation of whether self-acceptance of sexuality is associated with minority stressors or difficulties with mental health in LGBTQ plus individuals. And it looks into 5 bibliographic databases, and 89 studies is what they were going to use, but ended up only using 13 of those. And they used quantitative data to investigate associations between self-acceptance, minority stressors, and or mental health as stated above within LGBTQ plus samples, or differences in self-acceptance between different sexual orientations. So this article was given the potential importance of self-acceptance for LGBTQ plus populations. Also included in this article was that the majority of the study was conducted in the United States, as well as Israel, Russia, and others. They included 6,894 participants. Half of these participants were identified as male, and the other half was female. Most participants identified as LGBTQ+, which was 82%, and which 82% identified as lesbian or gay. 14% was identified as bisexual, and 4% with other minority orientations, such as pansexual, queer, etc. 78% of the participants were white, and the remaining 22% were from another race or ethnicity-related groups. Here are some of the problems that were included in the article. There is increased risk of mental health difficulties in sexual minority populations compared to heterosexual peers. Those with mental health difficulties were suggested to also have an increased vulnerability to the negative effects of minority stressors. The distal end of the continuum refers to external objective stressful events, including experiences of heterosexist prejudice, stigma, discrimination, and microaggressions, and many individuals who are identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and with other non-heterosexual orientations experience stigma, prejudice, discrimination because of their sexuality. Also, lower self-acceptance of sexuality was associated with suicide, depression symptoms, mental health, psychological distress, internalized heterosexism, disclosure to family, stressors, disclosure to others, heterosexist victimization, and lack of acceptance by friends and family. So looking at this study, they only included 2 research questions, which were the following. The first one is self-acceptance of sexuality or general self-acceptance statistically associated with minority stress and mental health or well-being in LGBTQ plus individuals? And the second one was, are there statistical differences in general or sexuality self-acceptance between different sexual orientations? The story presented in The View really focuses and digs deeper within what self-acceptance is. So they define it and they talk about the different types of self-acceptance. So like body self-acceptance and mindfulness acceptance and self-acceptance of sexuality and so forth, and how they use different instruments in this study requiring and looking into self-acceptance and what that looks like, which is a huge part of coming out as part of the LGBT community. They have to find that acceptance in themselves versus the world and society and what their loved ones may think as well. So that's why this article really digs deep into accepting our own true selves, no matter what that may look like. So that's a huge part of what this behind the story is. Secondly, within this literature review, they include citations, study designs, sample size, characteristics, measurements of self-acceptance, like I said earlier just now, sexual orientation, mental health outcomes, and minority stressors, and relevant analysis and results. Authors' assumptions. So they assume and consider that self-acceptance of sexuality to be the inverse of internalized heterosexism, and therefore self-acceptance is often measured using self-report instruments designed to capture internalized heterosexism or negative societal attitudes. They assume that with future research into self-acceptance, that should only utilize measures specifically designed to measure this construct of self-acceptance. And lastly, they assume that self-acceptance of sexuality is associated with better mental health. The next thing I'm going to talk about are the different findings that were included in this literature review and with the different studies. So there were 4 specifically that the article included, which are listed below, but each of them had a lot of information about the different findings. So I'm going to try and include some of them that were found within all the different studies that were included. So the first one is self-acceptance and distill stressors. So a lot of these studies included and found that the poorer LGBTQ plus individuals and their self-acceptance was associated with a lack of acceptance of one's sexuality by family and friends. There was also another study that was conducted in the United States and Israel, and they found that self-acceptance of sexuality had a small negative relationship with a lower level of acceptance of those participants of the LGBTQ plus by their families. Another study further found that the negative relationship between a lack of a friend's acceptance and the LGBTQ plus self-acceptance upheld while controlling for the lack of family acceptance. So those are just a few of the first one, which was self-acceptance and distill stressors. Another one is the self-acceptance and proximal stressors. So within this, internalized heterosexism was have found to have a significant negative relationship with self-acceptance of sexuality in one of the studies that was conducted in Russia. Another study attempted to disclose within a heterosexist environment, and they found that can have a negative impact on self-acceptance, whereas disclose to supportive and accepting of others can facilitate access to affirm and support experiences to improve self-acceptance. The third one that I'm going to talk about is the self-acceptance of mental health. So there was a finding of this review that generally suggests that self-acceptance of sexuality is associated with better mental health. So there were 3 studies that were conducted, one in Israel and one in the United States, and they found that the various measures of psychology distress had a small to medium negative relationship with self-acceptance of sexuality. And there was another 2 other Israel studies, and within that they found that relationships between self-acceptance of sexuality and psychological distress and well-being was maintained while controlling for demographic variables outlined with sexuality, distil and proximal harassment, family and family support, LGBTQ plus connectedness, religiousity, victimization, and being in a steady relationship. And again, there's so much I could share with you, but I also want to keep moving forward. So the next one is self-acceptance comparison between different sexual orientations. So with this, there was a study that found that lesbian women had significantly lower self-acceptance of sexuality than gay men in a young adult sample from Israel. Another study with this was conducted in Israel, again, with adolescents and young adults who identified as male or female, and found that bisexual individuals had lower self-acceptance of sexuality than lesbian or gay participants. So those were just a few of the findings that they had in this overall literature study and the different things that were included in the review. Authors' conclusions. So in conclusion, the authors suggest that self-acceptance of sexuality is negatively associated with the presence of some distilled stressors. Also, they state there needs to be further and a more robust research investigating both self-acceptance of sexuality and general self-acceptance within the LGBTQ plus populations. Also, a lot of these findings within the study consist with minority stress and identified developmental theories. Unfortunately, with a lot of limitations, the included studies include their cross-sectional designs, which limit the ability to draw firm conclusions. A lot of the findings suggest that there are clear need for further and more robust research investigating both self-acceptance of sexuality and general self-acceptance within the LGBTQ plus populations. And lastly, here were 4 specifically limitations that were included. The study did not use validated measures of suicidality or self-acceptance. The screening of titles and abstracts were completed by only 1 researcher, which may mean potentially relevant articles may have been missed. There was a large amount of heterogeneity between different study populations and designs, And lastly, many relevant studies were excluded due to using measures originally designed to measure other variables such as internalized heterosexism, self-esteem, and other LGBTQ+ related processes, which the author either adapted or used as a proxy for self-acceptance of sexuality. Here is my reference. I found this article through the Bethel Library under their articles. Overall, I found this topic very fascinating. As a Christian, I don't, agree with the choice of LGBTQ+, but I want to learn to be accepting of people who are different from me, and ever since I'm not quite sure what class it was probably the last one with diversity, when we had to watch a documentary of either racism or LGBTQ+, and I did that, and I found it very fascinating. And as I currently work with at junior high, we have a lot of students who are a part of this community, and so I don't know, I just find it very fascinating, and I want to learn how I can help these individuals, especially in the school setting. So that is the reason why I picked this, just because I find it very fascinating and I like learning about it. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please send them my way. I will try my best to answer them. Thanks.